I'm Jacques deLisle, Director of the Asia Program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I'm also a Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us. As I suspect all of you know, FPRI is a nonpartisan think tank. We're based in Philadelphia, and we'd like to welcome you from wherever you're joining us today. A few housekeeping matters before we get started. This is in webinar format. So as you raise your questions, please do so in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Chat we use mostly to send you messages, and I think we'll be putting a reference to the book we'll be talking about today into that box and maybe a few other things. We'd also like to thank our members and partners for their support, and if you're not yet a member, please consider joining FPRI. We need your assistance to continue providing these programs. They're free to you, but they're not free to us, as our president Raleigh likes to say. And we hope you'll join us for some other upcoming events in our series at FPRI. On Thursday, May 6th at noon, there'll be a session on enterprising extremists, crime, religion, and the business of violence in Pakistan with Orbis editor Nicholas Gosdev, and joined by Rabia Zafar to discuss Zafar's article in the spring issue of Orbis, our journal. And on Friday, May 7th at 10 a.m., we'll have a session on America's approach to the 3Cs initiative in Central Europe with FPRI's Eurasia Program Director, Chris Miller, and the Chargé d'Affaires at the Embassy of Estonia, Marco Koplima, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, and the European Studies Center's Linus Kojala, and they'll be discussing that initiative. Upcoming Asia program events include one on Friday, May 21st, which we'll be doing as a collaboration between Penn's project on the future of U.S.-China relations and the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, a project that FPRI also co-sponsors at 9:30 a.m. on May 21st. And that'll be on U.S.-China relations, specifically the issues of academic and educational and research exchange and academic freedom. And finally, back here in our FPRI Thursday afternoon at 2 series on Asia policy, we'll have Fiona Cunningham of George Washington University talking about security issues in U.S.-China relations. Let me get on with today's programming, which is what you all tuned in for. We'll be talking about our new book that June Dreyer and I co-edited, and that Russel Hsiao, Vincent Wang, and others are contributors to, that looks at Taiwan in the era of Tsai Ing-wen. It's out from Routledge in their Taiwan Studies series edited by the formidable David Fell. Let me introduce my co-panelists, our speakers today. First, we have June Teufel Dreyer, who is obviously the co-editor, my colleague on the book, and a senior fellow in the Asia program at FPRI and professor of political science at the University of Miami, Coral Gables. She was formerly the senior Far East specialist at the Library of Congress. She's also served as Asia policy advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations and a commissioner of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. She's the author of many books and articles on China, Japan, and other things in that part of the world. We also have with us Vincent Wang. Vincent is a senior fellow at the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Institute, right here. He's also dean and professor of political science at Adelphi University. Before that, he was dean and professor of political science, dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences at Ithaca College. He was also, before that, professor of political science and chairman of the department at the University of Richmond. He's also written quite widely on Taiwan issues, U.S.-Taiwan relations, and other such things. And last but far from least, Russel Hsiao. Russell is the executive director of the Global Taiwan Institute, an entity down in Washington whose programming on Taiwan I really recommend to everyone. It's massive and in-depth and quite insightful. He's also editor-in-chief of Global Taiwan Brief, which is a great source for up-to-the-minute information on what's going on with Taiwan. He's also currently a Penn Campbell Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and an adjunct fellow at Pacific Forum. So I'm going to say a few words to start us off about the book that we'll be talking about today, and I hope we're not going to make this a dry book talk. We're going to talk about the issues the book addresses, but let me just say a bit about the volume itself. It originated as a conference that FPRI Asia program held jointly with the Brookings Institution and its Center for, I believe, then it was Northeast Asian Policy, or East Asian Policy, helmed by the formidable Richard Bush. And we did a conference as the Tsai administration was just getting started. Tsai Ing-wen had been elected president in 2016. She just took office then in May, and this conference was held that summer. And there was a sense that this was a pivotal moment for Taiwan for a few reasons. Striking, of course, to have a female president elected in a democracy in East Asia, and one who had no political ties. She wasn't a Gandhi or a Park. She wasn't somebody who came from a political lineage. perhaps more importantly for Taiwan politics, it was the return of the Democratic Progressive Party, what's often loosely referred to as the pro-independence party, to power. And the last time they had held the presidency under Chen Shui-bian from 2000 to 2008 was a fairly rocky time in cross-strait relations and in U.S.-Taiwan relations at times. Even at one point with the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State rebuking Taiwan's then outgoing president for a referendum on Taiwan's possible entry into the UN and how that was a problem for American interests. It was also a sense that it was a pivotal point because, given that background, there were worries that the cross-strait relationship, which had been extremely stable in the 8 years prior to 2016, had actually been more than stable. It had been warming and becoming closer, rapprochement, under the Kuomintang Party's president, Ma Ying-jeou. And U.S.-Taiwan relations were also in quite good shape. People were taken to saying that they were the best they had been since the end of formal diplomatic relations in 1979. So the prospect that a very different party would return to power, and then once Tsai was elected, the very cold shoulder that her very moderate positions on cross-strait relations drew from Beijing. They rejected anything that was short of a full-fledged acceptance of Beijing's policy of one China and its one China principle and its so-called 92 consensus. We'll get into the details of those policies, I'm sure, as we talk today. And there was also a sense that Tsai was taking on a heck of a lot. She had a very ambitious program of economic revitalization, social welfare policies, social justice, transitional justice to deal with the questions of the authoritarian era of Kuomintang rule before democratization in Taiwan in the late 1980s. So there was a lot going on here, and this book came out of that conference. It took about 4 years, plus a bit, to see it turn into the current volume. That's partly just the way the publishing biz goes these days, but it's also because things were changing really fast, and we wanted to have an opportunity to catch up on this thing. So about half of the chapters in this book are based on much updated and expanded versions of what appeared in the conference papers, which were published in a special issue of Orbis back in 2016, and about half the chapters are completely new authors that were not part of the initial conference, and in many cases that cover topics that we didn't fully address in the conference. So the book comes out as Tsai moves fairly far into her second term. She was reelected in 2020 with quite a comfortable margin, similar to the first time round. And her election reflected some of the changes that went on in the interim. The economy improved somewhat. The issues, the controversy in Hong Kong, the pro-democracy, anti-extradition law protests and China's reaction to them gave Tsai quite a boost in her re-election bid, because the Chinese-backed model, the Xi Jinping insisted upon model of one country, two systems, became even more anathema to most Taiwanese voters. And Tsai played that quite well. And the KMT, frankly, did not run the best of campaigns. They chose a populist, unorthodox, and ultimately not terribly effective candidate. So she came into office for a second round with a legislative majority. The DPP retained its first ever from 4 years earlier legislative majority with reduced margins. So as she moves farther into her second term, this book is now out, and we're going to talk about some of what's in the book, including some updating for the things that have happened even since this went to press a few months ago and came out just the last couple of weeks. The book covers domestic politics. It also covers economics and cultural issues. We won't get into that too much today. We're going to focus, appropriately enough at FPRI, on the external relations aspects. And we have almost all the authors of the external relations focused chapters with us today. Each of them is going to give a brief overview of his or her chapter, and then we'll get into a broader discussion. I will say one thing, because we're going to be going on a bit longer than usual, probably with the initial presentations, given that there are 4 of us. I encourage you to put into the Q&A function any questions you may have about the topic currently being discussed. So when Vincent Wang is talking, consider putting in questions on U.S.-Taiwan relations. When Russel Hsiao is talking on cross-straits and for Japan issues when Teufel Dreyer is talking. So we'll go through those things. Of course, if you have more questions that come in later at the end, we'll put those in too, but we'll try to weave in questions and intersperse them. So I've already burned through more than enough time here. So let me turn to our first speaker here, which is Vincent Wang. Professor Wang will talk about the state of U.S.-Taiwan relations.
Thank you, Jacques. As Jacques mentioned, that this is a book of a labor of love. So we have benefited from the ever-evolving realities and the conceptual frameworks for the last 4 years. The chapter Jacques and I are responsible for talks about the U.S.-Taiwan relations. Obviously, a lot has happened in the last 4 years. So I thought I would start out by helping us conceptualize this important relationship in a conceptual model, what I would call a three-move model. So we often talked about a triangular relationship among the United States, China, and Taiwan. In this triangle, there are three didactic relationships. The relationship between Taiwan and mainland China, it's called the cross-strait relations, relationship between the Taiwan and the United States, and relationship between the US and China. So if we look back in the last 20 or 25 years, we discern a very distinctive pattern, what I call the three-move pattern. Namely, that in this triangular relationship, it often was Taiwan, which was basically not totally satisfied with this triangular arrangement, try to move what we would call the first move. And the first move actually had genesis in Taiwan's domestic politics, namely as Taiwan became more and more democratized and its citizens want to have more international presence, and they also define their relationship with the mainland very differently. So the first democratic era Taiwan President Li Denghui became the president in 1988 as the result of the death of President Jiang Jingguo. And he was the first native Taiwan president, and he began a very accelerated process of democratization. All these so-called everlasting legislators were retired, and popular election was held in Taiwan in early 1990s. And then he also abolished the so-called temporary provisions. So redefined the relations between Taiwan and mainland China. In 1996, he won in the four-way race to become the first democratic elected president of Taiwan. And China was not very pleased and launched a missile attacks against Taiwan, or missile intimidation against Taiwan. So Li Denghui also was very energetic in pushing Taiwan on international forums. For example, Taiwan's campaign to be returned to the United Nations began in 1993, 94. So this democratization, changing national identity, a quest for international personhood were consistent themes for all future Taiwanese leaders. In 1999, Li formulated the so-called 特殊国与国关系, or special state-to-state relations, which yet again clearly defined the cross-strait relations quite different from his predecessors. So this is the first move. And the second move, of course, was usually China, which did not like the move made by Taiwan and responded with very aggressive missile threats or verbal threats and so on. And then typically the United States being Taiwan's implicit security guarantor would step in to restore the status quo or the status quo ante. And therefore, the status will continue to the next stage. Now, when 2000, when Chen Shui-bian became the first president to come from the opposition party, Democratic Progressive Party, a historically pro-Taiwan Independence Party, that he had to make a lot of reassurances. So in his inaugural speech, he talked about 四不一没有, or 4 no's and 1 without. And for the first 2 years, he was actually very conciliatory, but mainland China distrusts him. And then in 2002, Chen began a formulation called 一边一国, or China and Taiwan on one side of either side of the Taiwan Strait. And then, of course, China responded even more negatively. And this called for the United States, the third mover, to restore the status quo. Toward the end of the Chen era, both Taiwan-US relations and Taiwan-China relations became very negative. At one point, that former President George W. Bush actually openly criticized President Chen in front of the visiting Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao. Now, in 2008, the KMT candidate Ma Ying-jeou won by a landslide, and he took a 180 against Chen's policy. So you can say that his first move was actually to move to a different direction. Instead of designification, he reformulated a Chinese narrative, and cross-strait relations entered into a very harmonious, at least peaceful era. He adopted a policy of so-called 亲美和中友日, or pro-US peace with China and friendly toward Japan. And he quickly signed a so-called economic framework agreement with mainland China, and cross-strait so-called 三通, three communications were fully established. And in fact, toward the end, and mainland China responded with also some relaxation of the strangulation of Taiwan's international participation. For example, Taiwan was allowed to attend the World Health Assembly and International Civil Aviation Organization, and so on. And the United States also responded by some measurable improvement of US-Taiwan relations. But toward the end of the Ma era, a different kind of concern arose, which was whether the Taiwan was moving too fast and too closely toward China. Therefore, the momentum cannot be stopped. In 2014, the so-called Sunflower Movement, student-led movement, which basically derailed any forward movement of cross-strait economic relations. And that actually presaged the electoral victory of Tsai Ing-wen in 2016. 2016, this is the second DPP president. Obviously, China was very distrustful, but so far, most US analysts believe that Tsai has actually abjured the first move. Unlike her predecessor, she has not made the first move. In fact, that it was China that was seen as making the first move. So the US actually changed its historical role as the third mover to become the second mover. In the Trump administration, at the very beginning, there was a fear whether Trump would actually fundamentally change more than 4 decades of US-Taiwan relations by taking a phone call from President Tsai. That turned out to be short-lived. In fact, that there was a different kind of concern whether Trump, being very mercurial and also unpredictable, might actually betray Taiwan. But toward the end of the Trump presidency, the US has actually significantly elevated its policy toward Taiwan. So when Biden became president earlier this year, initially, there was concern whether Biden would actually return to the historical, more conciliatory policy toward China. But so far, I think that the Biden administration has stuck to the very tough line inherited from the Trump administration. And maybe we can say that the Biden administration is still in search of its policy on China. So I think I will stop here just to say that this three-move analytical framework really helped us understand the evolution of US-Taiwan relations, but not necessarily more of the same in the Biden administration. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Vincent, for that overview of our rather complicated chapter. I'll just add one thing that we get to near the end of the chapter, which is there's a question about whether this three-move structure has been breaking down some. So one of the notable things about Tsai's presidency is that she has been quite careful to avoid being provocative, to avoid taking the first move to trigger a pushback from Beijing. In that sense, she has not resembled possibly Li Denghui, certainly not resembled Chen Shui-bian, nor has she resembled Ma Ying-jeou in terms of taking some steps toward changing cross-strait relations in a more cooperative or alignment type basis rather than moving away. So that's raised the question of whether if Taiwan stands pat and doesn't disrupt things, will China or perhaps the US become the first mover, the disruptor? And I think that's a question we're a little agnostic on. Beijing has been ratcheting up pressure, as Russell will talk about, on Taiwan in a way that looks a little bit like China making the first move. And under Trump, there was a real concern about whether the US was making the first move by really ratcheting up, or at least making a move in response to China's signals that would ratchet up the level of U.S. support towards something that looked a bit more like an alliance. We've even had a discussion about whether the U.S. should abandon its traditional position of strategic ambiguity, that is, leaving it somewhat vague about under what circumstances we would come to Taiwan's defense in the event of pressure from China, versus some kind of strategic clarity that would draw those lines, but then would also entail commitments that would be hard to back away from. Before I turn to June, we're going to try to weave in a couple of questions here that came in the chat. And they basically are, I think it's fair to say, questions about the possibility of something I just touched upon in my last comment, which is a possibility of a significant upgrading in U.S.-Taiwan relationships. And two markers for that would be formal recognition, formal reestablishment of formal diplomatic relations. And the idea has been bandied about. In fact, Taiwan's foreign minister, Joseph Wu, Jacques, kind of pushed back a bit against that. And the other is the possibility of stationing troops, which of course would strengthen the credibility of a defense commitment. It's the way you usually signal support for an ally, but that would be quite a major shift given the position we've been in since the termination of the Mutual Security Pact back in 1979 as part of the derecognition of the ROC, recognition of the PRC. So Vincent, would you care to speak to whether those two things are possible, and if possible, would they be welcomed by Taiwan, and would they be a good idea?
Sure. I think it's probably unquestionable that U.S.-Taiwan relations have improved a great deal, to the point that often that we'll test sort of the outer boundary of the so-called unofficial relations framework established by a Taiwan Relations Act and so on. And I think that these two indicators, whether U.S. can station troops on Taiwan or Taiwan is ready for a diplomatic recognition, might be, sort of the most concrete indicators. I think that the Taiwanese, in general, maybe some people in the government are obviously looking forward to any improvement of U.S.-Taiwan relations and with the U.S. However, that also needs to be weighed against the possible, very almost predictably a negative, very negative reaction from China. So the question really for responsible statesmen is, how do you conduct U.S.-Taiwan relations in such a way that you strengthen the substance as much as possible without breaking sort of a framework, a legal framework, juridical framework, without at this moment without a functional substitute. I think that China may have already mentioned in some policy statements that formal diplomatic relations may be a cause belli,
One more question before we move on to June. This is a quote shared with us from a recent tweet by President Tsai Ing-wen from our friend Michael Fante at the DPP office in Washington, which the tweet I think that's consistent with a lot of things that President Tsai has said over time. But this one I think sums up an idea relevant to the discussion we just had, which is, we will neither bow to pressure nor act rashly when we have support. Vincent, thoughts about that comment?
I think that's a very moderate, entirely reasonable stance, a characteristic of President Tsai Ing-wen, which most analysts in the United States seem to take, at least on her face value. It's very hard to argue that any Taiwanese leader adopting such a reasonable stance would not win public support, outright public support in the United States.
I want to turn to June. I'll just say in response to Michael's comment a couple of things. One is that it shows, to me at least, that President Tsai greatly understands the note one needs to hit, which is that U.S. policy toward cross-strait relations hinges very much on U.S. assessments of who's the provocateur when things go badly. And this is a way of Tsai reinforcing the point that she's not going to be the one doing the provoking, that Beijing is doing the provoking. And I think that's been the reading in Washington, and understandably so, given the facts on the ground and on the water. The other is, I think it shows a subtle appreciation of the concerns about alliance dynamics. That is, if you have a weaker partner or the junior partner in a quasi-alliance that is deeply concerned about its own vulnerability, then it may act rashly and you may be entrapped into a situation you don't want to be in if you're the U.S. On the other hand, if you write too much of a blank check or expect to do so, then you can get entrapped another way. So it's the abandonment entrapment sort of dynamic. You don't want your alliance partner, I muffed that a little bit, but you don't want your alliance partner to worry about abandonment. You don't want them to think that display is unconditional. I think this says, I get it, that we have to be in that intermediate zone, but it's important to have support so you don't trigger the abandonment fears and reassurance that Taiwan won't do something which will lead to entrapment. So smuggled in a little garbled IR theory there, but let me now turn to my colleague, June Dreyer, to speak a bit about Taiwan-Japan relations, which are, I would say, probably Taiwan's second most important friendly external relationship, and one that has really seen some interesting developments during the last 5 years or so.
Let me just pile on a little bit about the previous conversation. And that is, I think that Tsai is very aware, since she's an extremely cautious person, that some people have said we cannot give up strategic ambiguity because this may tempt Taiwan to do something rash and bring the United States in. And by that statement, she has very cleverly said, we want your support, but we will never go beyond that to put you in trouble. And I think she had phrased it just exactly perfectly. And as this applies to Taiwan-Japan relations, I think you see something now, since we're talking about first movers and second movers, and that is that the Japanese have said to us very clearly in the form of a statement by their foreign minister before the Suga-Biden summit, that they will not be the first mover. They are taking their cues on Taiwan from the United States. And they were very, very explicit about that. So let me go back to Jacques was saying that the relations between the United States and Taiwan got very bad during the Chen Shui-bian administration and got very good under the Ma Ying-jeou administration, and you find exactly the opposite pattern in Taiwan-Japan relations. They were good during the Chen Shui-bian administration. In fact, they've been good ever since Japan was defeated in World War II. Chiang Kai-shek actually rather admired the Japanese. His soldiers fought alongside Japanese soldiers in China after the war ended because both sides were very anti-communist. And he actually Chiang Kai-shek actually hired Japanese advisors for his military. And, Li Denghui, everybody knows, in fact, the Chinese are very angry about it. Li Denghui had this habit of pointing out that he had been a Japanese citizen before he became a citizen of Taiwan, which angered them greatly. So again, from the beginning, it seemed that not only had Japan-Taiwan relations got better after Tsai was elected, but they got better not just recouping the previous situation pre-Ma Ying-jeou, but actually surpassed it. And this happened very suddenly from the beginning, in that the Japanese foreign minister at the time was Kishida, and then also the prime minister, who was Abe, sent their personal congratulations to Tsai. And what's interesting about that, because leaders are always saying happy birthday to each other, or happy Buddha's birthday to each other. But what was interesting about this is the first time they had done that since the Japanese broke diplomatic relations with the Republic of China in 1972. So, the Japanese are big on symbolism, and that was symbolically very important, even though they're always very careful to qualify it by saying, we're going to enjoy close economic and people-to-people relations. In other words, leaving political and military conspicuously out. But then there was one further development, and as far as I can tell, it was the Japanese side that took the initiative on this, and that was the renaming of the liaison organization between Tokyo and Taipei, which had been known under the thoroughly confusing name of the Interchange Organization. Well, interchange between what and whom. And they announced, again, very shortly after Tsai's election, that this would now be called the Japan-Taiwan Exchange Organization. And again, the symbolism is there because they have elevated Japan and Taiwan to parity. In other words, this was not Japan province of Taiwan relationship. And only a couple of months later did Taiwan rename its TECO, Taiwan Economic and Cultural Organization in Japan, to rename it the Taiwan-Japan Relations Organization. And so that rectified something that had existed since 1992. And after that, before 1992, it had an even less meaningful name, ARIR, the Asian Relations Association. Now, the things have progressed since then, always very, very cautiously, and with Japan always trying to say this is within the understanding of our One China policy. And Japan's understanding of the One China policy is another interesting phenomenon because they adopted the American formula. In other words, they recognize that China thinks Taiwan is a part of China, but they do not say they agree with it. So it's a very cautious response on the part of the Japanese. Nonetheless, when they have an agreement with Taiwan on something or other, and there have been lots of them, for example, if it's on fisheries, they always conclude it between the Taiwan Fisheries Association and the Japan Fisheries Association in order not to give credence to the certain PRC charge that this is a tacit recognition of Taiwan's sovereignty. They've come close, but they never quite take that final step. Now, so that's been going on for some time now. And what's recently, 2000, Li Donghui, the grandfather, I call him Taiwan's Guofu, the founding father of Taiwan, he passed away. And a former Japanese prime minister was sent to the funeral. And he said explicitly in front of the cameras that Prime Minister Abe has expressed the wish to talk to Tsai Ing-wen, which would have been a step up if there is an opportunity. Now, so far there hasn't been an opportunity, but nonetheless, the word is out there. And of course, Abe is no longer prime minister. So that was a step forward. And that's the kind of little incremental thing that's been going on. Another one is the annual report of the Japan's National Defense Report. And this is allegedly by a private organization, except the private organization is housed within the Ministry of Defense headquarters, and its budget is covered by the Japanese defense budget. And they will do whole reports on Taiwan, never exactly saying we consider it a sovereign nation, but if you didn't know better, you wouldn't be able to guess that from the way they talk. Okay, now, just 2 months ago, let's see, yes, 2.5 months ago, in February, the Liberal Democratic Party set up a Taiwan project team to consider how to strengthen relations with Taiwan. And they've talked about various things, one of them being a Taiwan Relations Act, a Japanese Taiwan Relations Act. That's been talked about for years, but this seems to have given it a push forward. And they also talked about enhanced intelligence sharing. We know they already share intelligence, but this will go a step further. And closer coordination by Coast Guards. And this is a very interesting one, because as you know, both Taiwan and the People's Republic of China claim the Diaoyu/Senkaku Islands. So if their Coast Guard, Taiwan Coast Guard is cooperating with the Japanese Coast Guard to defend those islands, that implies a tacit united front against the Chinese claim. And then there also been talk of exchanging military liaison officers, and including Taiwan in a missile defense network. And again, that's something to watch because thus far they have been very, very chary of putting a military dimension on Japan-Taiwan cooperation. Economically, the Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation has said it's going to invest $177.7 million in a fully owned subsidiary in Japan's Ibaraki prefecture. As you know, there's a tremendous shortage of chips, and Japan is eager to get back in the game. This is very important. And then also, there have been Prime Minister Suga's comment, and his comments about Taiwan at the summit were very tepid. I was disappointed in them. He didn't say anything wrong, but he didn't say anything very right either. But after the statement, he was quoted as saying to his aides that, quote, the Senkakus and Taiwan are linked. And you're thinking, what's important about that? Because Suga has been at great pains to get the Biden administration to say to the United States, we, the United States, will defend the Senkaku Islands against incursion by the Chinese. And Biden wants the Japanese to commit to defend Taiwan. So if Suga says those two things are linked, that is extremely important. Okay.
We're running up against time here, June.
Can I just say one more thing?
Sure.
Okay. Kishi Nobuo, who is the younger brother of former Prime Minister Abe, at the same time the Suga summit in Washington was going on, visited Yonaguni, which is the island of Japan that is supposed to be so close to Taiwan that you can see one from the other. And what was he doing there? And he was asked for a comment, and he said, on a clear day, I'm told you can see Taiwan from here, but this is a cloudy day. And I will leave you chewing on the symbolism of that. Thank you for the extra minute, Jacques.
Sure. Thanks. And one question we'll loop back to if we have time at the end, but I think applies to both of the talks, both the remarks so far, which is one of the things the Biden administration has done is to put a bit more emphasis on the Quad, the Japan, Australia, India, U.S. alignment to push back against China. And I'd be interested to hear everyone's thoughts on what that means for Taiwan. But before we turn to that, let me pass the platform, the microphone, the Zoom box, whatever the term is, along to Russel Hsiao to tackle the so easy and simple topic of cross-strait relations.
Well, thank you very much, Jacques and June, for the invitation to participate in this book project. Greetings from the GTI satellite office. But I think, cognizant of the time that we have left, I will keep my comments very brief. I think the underlying purpose that my co-author and I had for our chapter is to really document the evolution of cross-strait relations over the last 4 years. And the reason for that is because we found it necessary in observing a lot of commentaries on current developments related to cross-strait relations as based on generalizations of a very narrow set of information. And I think what you'll find, at least when we sort of document all these developments, is that there are a lot of consistencies and there are also subtle changes that we can take into account and really try to then understand and unpack the trajectory of cross-strait relations, especially in the context of the Tsai administration. I think I would just sort of put three main points that I would like to emphasize. And of course, I want to encourage all the audience members to go purchase a copy of the book because it goes into a greater details of that I simply don't have the time to go into. But they are important details, right? And I think the first point that I would like to make is the fact that this pressure campaign that seems to be a common fact really began even before President Tsai took office. That's point number one. The second point is that there have been clear changes in the PRC's approach to cross-strait relations. Not the policy itself, but the approach to cross-strait relations. And the third point is that the Tsai government's policies have been very consistent and steady in terms of its approach to cross-strait relations. So what do I mean by these three main points? Let me just sort of add some meat to those. The first, in terms of the pressure campaign and how it began, there were actually some conflicting signals beginning after President Tsai's election. For those of you who follow the sort of the play-by-play in Washington, D.C., probably took note of when PRC's Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave a pretty significant policy speech at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C., where he suggested, the Beijing's softening approach to cross-strait relations, where he indicated that Beijing had hoped that that President Tsai could, in her own way, address the policy concerns of Beijing. And yet, the month after that, really the first salvo of the diplomatic offensive that we continue to we saw throughout the Tsai administration's 4 years and ongoing, began with PRC's decision to accept the establishment of diplomatic ties with Gambia. Now, Gambia is interesting because actually they had broken diplomatic ties with Taiwan, ROC, years before, but was basically told to wait by Beijing, in consideration of the, sort of more the stable and cordial relations that Beijing had with Taipei under the prior administration. And this was the case for actually multiple diplomatic partners of Taiwan. I think it was sort of a known secret that many of Taiwan's diplomatic partners were basically sitting on the fence, and Beijing had basically wanted to, hold off on accepting those diplomatic relations for a card that it could play in future administrations, where it could utilize as a means to pressure Taiwan, and that they did in very clear and compelling ways. And so that was really the first salvo, and that was well before, again, when first President Tsai was inaugurated president in May of 2016. The second point is that these clear changes in the PRC's approach to Taiwan cross-strait relations are reflected not only in statements and actions, but also in personnel. Right? I think oftentimes when we talk about policy, it's a common refrain here in Washington that personnel is policy, right? And I think that also applies to a certain degree in the PRC's policy apparatus and policymaking process with regards to Taiwan, but implementation. Let's talk about implementation, and that's reflected in the personnel at the Taiwan Affairs Office of the State Council, as well as the sort of the premier think tanks in PRC's pseudo government think tank in terms of the China Academy of Social Sciences and other national level United Front academic institutions that focus on Taiwan, and there are plenty of those. But personnel-wise, I think the most significant, to highlight was, of course, the placement of Liu Jieyi over Zhang Zhijun. Now, Liu Jieyi, of course, for those of you who may not be familiar with, was the former PRC ambassador to the United Nations, and certainly was a very well-known international sort of diplomat. And so I think his placement there in a position where he was going to be focused primarily and only on cross-strait relations had really significant implications. This was also augmented by the placement of Yang Mingjie over Zhou Zhihua in the China Academy of Social Sciences. For those, also for many of us who focus on China's policymaking apparatus, is a unit associated with the Ministry of State Security, and probably the premier research institution focused on Taiwan. And Yang Mingjie, someone who, again, was not a cross-strait expert, but very much an arms control, international security expert. And his placement there in that position was also very telling. And I can go through the list in terms of other personnels that indicated this sort of, I think, quite a substantial change in the approach of how PRC intended to deal with Taiwan. I think the actions are already clear in terms of the pressure campaign, in terms of the diplomatic offensive, the economic incentives and measures that they were taken, sort of a combination of carrots and sticks approach. And so I won't go into details there, but I do also think that the Hong Kong was also a very important indicator of how the PRC saw the relationship between Hong Kong and Taiwan. Now we can get into that in discussions if there are any interest. The third main point that I wanted to conclude with is really the Tsai government's consistent and stable approach to cross-strait relations. I think this picks up pretty neatly from Vincent's and as well as Jacques' intro, where Jacques was saying that yes, that basically Taipei was confronted with a very cold shoulder for a very modest approach, and Vincent sort of when he described sort of Tsai as abjuring or abstaining from a first mover sort of tactic, and I think this is borne out by the facts of this documents of actions taken by the various sides, and we found that especially with the first inaugural speech, I think that really set the tone for the approach of the Tsai administration, and that which I think hewed pretty closely to a more orthodox approach, a view of cross-strait relations, where she said that her cross-strait policy was going to be based on the ROC Constitution, the law governing the relations between the people of the mainland area and the Taiwan area, as well as the historical fact of the 1992 meetings and so forth. And yet, nonetheless, Beijing just called it an incomplete test paper, right? I think, quote, incomplete test paper, unquote. And follow that with a successive range of diplomatic, political, military pressure to try to force Taipei to concede or accept Beijing's positions on the resumption of cross-strait negotiation. And frankly speaking, Taipei just didn't take the bait, right? I mean, I think it was an incessant effort to try to bait the Tsai government to engaging either in checkbook diplomacies, which was, I think, a feature of the cross-strait diplomatic battle for many decades, and basically Taipei said it was not going to play that game with Beijing any longer. And I think there was a recognition on the part of the United States that this pressure, if that continues on, would be very destabilizing to the cross-strait status quo. And I think these efforts have been underway to try to maintain those status quo ongoing. So I think with that, I'll just leave it and turn it over to the balance of my time, if I have any, and then for the conversation to follow.
Okay, so I'm going to put another question out there, which we'll loop back to for the entire panel at the end. I raised the issue of whether the Quad has significance for Taiwan and its security. So based on what Russell just raised, I'll also plan to the question for the panel to address. What challenges are posed by and what should be the responses to China's kind of ratcheting up the gray zone pressure on Taiwan, right? We've seen in recent months a stepping up of encroachments on the air defense identification zones, crossing the median line, circling. So the kinds of things that do essentially put some pressure on strategic ambiguity because they're ambiguous moves, as well as posing foreign policy challenges for Taiwan. So while my colleagues think about that, I'm going to do a quick overview of my chapter in the book, which is on Taiwan's quest for international status. I'll try to keep this fairly brief because it does overlap some with what my colleagues have already talked about here. And what I suggest in that chapter is that Taiwan under Tsai has adapted to new conditions and new immediate aims, a long-standing strategy of trying to gain and secure and keep from losing international space. And there are a few arrows in this quiver. One is to maintain formal diplomatic relations with the relatively small number of small states whose governments Taiwan and the ROC has been able to maintain diplomatic relations with. Why does this matter? Well, if you're going to be an international lawyer, having formal diplomatic relations is one of the criteria, at least one interpretation of one of the four criteria for statehood. More importantly, having diplomatic relations keeps Taiwan in the game. It makes it look and act more like a fully accepted state in the international system. It allows the president of the ROC to do head of state or head of government visits and things like that. So for that reason, downward pressure on Taiwan's number of diplomatic partners is significant. There was a diplomatic truce during the Ma era with the complication of the Gambia basically held steady throughout that period. But Taiwan's lost about a third of its then remaining diplomatic allies since then. There's now only one left in the developed world, one in Europe, one in Africa. One of the biggest by population has been lost, Panama, and Paraguay may be at risk if China plays some hardball vaccine diplomacy, or at least those the rumors we're hearing may not come to fruition. And here, there is some risk to Taiwan if the squeeze continues, but I wouldn't panic too much because there is no magic number. We don't know if 0, I guess, is a magic number, but 15 versus 14 doesn't matter all that much. Beijing is taking a risk if it squeezes Taiwan too hard on this, because Taiwan can effectively code switch and say, okay, diplomatic relations of the formal type falling apart. Well, guess what? Taiwan has highly robust informal relations, and indeed more than most undisputed countries or states in the international system too. The U.S. has started to push back a bit more on the squeeze, and ultimately, Taiwan has some residual capacity there. Secondly, there's informal relations. We've talked about the two most important informal friendly relationships with the U.S. and with Japan. Informal relations also matter for state status in the international system, although a bit less clearly. But more to the point, it's the de facto guarantee of international support for Taiwan's continued autonomy. And it tells you something that this issue, things like informal relations with the US, draw the most ire from Beijing. They draw the condemnation for interfering in China's internal affairs and so on. We've seen that as a constant theme. The US is pretty locked into a stable position here. The Taiwan Relations Act both assumes and reinforces robust informal relations. Of the sacred texts of US-Taiwan relations, the 3 communiques, and the TRA is the most deeply embedded as well as the most pro-Taiwan. If you want to add a 4th sacred text, the 6 assurances, that's pretty pro-Taiwan too. And tellingly, it was finally declassified near the end of the previous administration. Despite some concerns going in, the Biden administration has taken a position that in terms of support for Taiwan is every bit as strong, rhetorically at least, as the Trump administration was, and with, I think, greater engagement with other allies in the region. And Congress has been part of the mix too. Lots of legislation, an alphabet soup of legislation passing by wide margins, supporting more robust or at least strong support for Taiwan. A second cluster of approaches is engagement with international organizations and institutions. This too has Taiwan acting and looking more like a state in the international system, or an undisputed state in the international system. And it has practical effects in the issue areas that international organizations regulate: trade, public health, etc. Core UN membership, of course, is unattainable ever since UN Resolution 2758, but Taiwan made some modest headway, most notably at the WHO, the World Health Organization, in the aftermath of SARS, and got a little closer to getting back in with the COVID debacle, and with Taiwan's handling COVID so incredibly well, but still didn't get quite through, but at least gained some moral points there. And Taiwan has limited engagement with other UN-linked organizations. It's been much more successful with other major international organizations, particularly in the trade and economy sphere, things like the WTO, APEC, the Asian Development Bank, and so on. And here, U.S. policy remains supportive, and the Biden administration's engagement with international organizations, being less skeptical of them than the Trump administration, may open some opportunities there. Third and finally, Taiwan's strategy has included as-if participation in international regimes, where Taiwan is not allowed formally to join treaties, which it is not in the UN system especially. Taiwan does things domestically or does things in its foreign policy that are the things that a full member of these regimes would do. So from the human rights covenants, the economic, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, to the public health regime with the WHA and the WHO, to UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea regime, to the major climate regime, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Taiwan takes foreign policy positions and does domestic law maneuvers and moves and engages in full-fledged state behavior that is consistent with what those regimes would require. That's helpful for looking and acting like a state. It's helpful for remaining on the international stage. And it's helpful for playing to the values themes, which have always been essential to foreign and especially US support for Taiwan, and that at least rhetorically have moved much more back to the center of US foreign policy with the new administration. Although they were hardly absent from many previous administrations of either party. So with that, I'll stop. I invite you to throw in more questions if you've got them in the Q&A function. But let me just start with the ones that were sitting out there. Well, actually, let me start with the first one here, which is our old friend Charlie Glazer, who weighed in several years ago on the question of whether the U.S. essentially should abandon Taiwan. That wasn't quite his wording. And now he has a new piece out about whether the U.S. really needs to be more sort of hard-headed in figuring out what its real interests are and how defensible its interests are. And some of the implications are that U.S. support for Taiwan, the U.S. ability to maintain something of the current cross-strait status quo, the current status of Taiwan, is going to be real tough in the face of a rising China, and that maybe we need to revisit our policy now and perhaps make modest gains while we can before the balance shifts farther. So that's a provocative series of articles from Charlie, and they've been drawing a lot of attention lately in international relations and policy circles. Anybody got any thoughts on that?
Yes.
Okay.
I view Charles Glazer as basically a perfect example of sea lion, a phrase that's become very popular lately. And you draw out something to provide a lot of controversy because it's not going to happen. And the United States not only has security interest in the Taiwan Strait, but Japan has even more security interest in the Taiwan Strait. And if we decommit to the US-Japanese relationship, and also to the US-Taiwan relationship, and lose all our credibility, what little we have left as a responsible ally. So I would prefer that Charles Glazer either find something new to talk about or talk about going to some other business.
And I just say that the abandoned Taiwan thesis, well, since we're at the year of brood X cicadas, it does come back every so often, right? So we've seen it from Glazer, we've seen it from Bruce Gilley in a Finlandization piece. So every few years this comes up and it ultimately doesn't gain a lot of traction. And I think Charlie's more recent piece is more nuanced than the earlier one. But this is an odd moment given how much U.S. support for Taiwan is actually at a relatively high ebb. Vincent or Russell, you want to weigh in on this topic? If not, I'll invite you to address the other question that's out there on the table. Go ahead.
Sure, I'm happy to just weigh in briefly, and I think June and Jacques both have covered sort of the criticism of Glazer's arguments quite articulately already. I would just argue, I'll just point out that I think this is less a piece about Taiwan policy as it is about China policy, and really, and I think that argument has sailed quite some time ago. Maybe 10 years ago, it had more salience in terms of accommodating China, in terms of and hoping that accommodation with China would make it more engaged and less threatening, or that more engaged with China, that would make it less threatening. And I think that there has been a really fundamental sea change in the attitudes in Washington, D.C. With regards to whether or not that approach has actually yielded any substantive results. And I think that argument 10 years ago may have had a little more salience, but I think it's one that has very little today.
Yeah, I would just say that I'll call the Charles Glazer's recommendation as preemptive appeasement. Although, of course, I mean,
I hear the rapid unfurling of Neville Chamberlain's umbrella.
No, I mean, you should remember, of course, in hindsight, the appeasement's got a bad name, but remember that Chamberlain, when he first proposed that, he said, buying ourselves a peace for our time, something like that. So I think Russell is right that that kind of policy recommendation might have been more relevant 10 or 15 years ago. But now with the current regime in Beijing, whose ambitions are much more than before, and are also much more confident about whose time has arrived, this preemptive appeasement will not do. In fact, that the U.S. has more to lose than to gain.
So we are absolutely up against time, but there's, with the indulgence of our audience and abusing my role as a chair here, I do want to get a chance to have all the three of you react to the other question out there, which is, and there are many questions out there, but one that I put on the table before, which is, how are circumstances changing? That is, how big a threat is it to Taiwan? How should Taiwan and the U.S. respond to what are essentially often called gray zone activities by Beijing? And I would put two things in a rather capacious definition of that category. One is these military measures that aren't attacks and don't seem to be imminent attacks, but are intimidating and are meant to sort of destabilize the status quo, the sending the ships and airplanes very close. We see some of that in the Japan-China relationship as well. That's one category. And the other is this cluster of behaviors that go into the rubric of political warfare or sharp power. The attempts to intervene and affect political thinking on Taiwan, whether it's through social media operations, through ownership of media, through just trying to rattle confidence and make more pro-Beijing positions, which may be sometimes authentically Taiwanese, but sometimes of external influence or disguised external origin. How is that changing the game, and how should Taiwan and or the United States, or for that matter, Japan, handle it? I think I'll go in the order we went with our initial presentation. So Vincent, June, and then Russell gets the last word.
I think the so-called the gray zone, low intensity maneuvers are a perfect opportunity for democracies such as Taiwan and the United States to cooperate, because China and other perpetrators actually take advantage of the open nature of democratic societies. So I think at the beginning, it may not be, Taiwan and the US may not have all the answers, and China will routinely circle Taiwan to become a quote unquote new normal and wear down Taiwan's defense forces and morale and so on. But I think that as long as the United States and Taiwan and other like-minded democracies can functionally work together, cooperate without being too ostentatious, that will actually boost Taiwanese morale and kind of effectively push back at Chinese aggression.
Okay, June?
Yeah, I'm a little disconcerted by this constant reference to as China gets stronger. And I was just reading the testimony, I actually was listening to it on C-SPAN, of Scott Bernier, the head of DIA, Lieutenant General Scott Bernier. And he talks about the 2030 timeframe after which other problems are going to kick in. And at that point, they called for classified session. Now, what's going to happen by 2030? China's having, believe it or not, a demographic crunch. It's run out of the population boom. Its economy is slowing. And you can play this either way. Either you can say Xi Jinping feels he has to attack Taiwan because he's going to lose the initiative if he doesn't, or you can play it the other way and say, if he doesn't get it by 2030, and assuming the United States is not in the type of decline that Xi Jinping wishes it was, and I don't think we are, that if we just hold off till 2030, the problem will ease, not get worse.
Thank you. And Russell?
Yeah, again, I subscribe to both what Vincent and June have both said. I think, gray zone, I relate gray zone cactus as a sort of a slow cooking sort of type of tactic in dealing with Taiwan. And, while I think the PLA had, the Chinese military and had in the past been able to get away with, the inability of the U.S. and its allies and partners to respond to these sort of tactics that fall right below the threshold of military, sort of conflict. That I think increasingly that the U.S. allies and partners in Taiwan also are thinking creatively about how to respond to these challenges. For the recognition that this was done so with a deliberate purpose to try to degrade Taiwan's ability and also the ability of its partners to respond. I think the political warfare component of it is really critical. It's one that I think really just only started to be addressed in the last 4 years, and I think that there needs to be constant attention paid to these issues because the United Front efforts of the Chinese Communist Party is not going away. It doesn't, and really these transparency is the best solution to these challenges. And so, and while I think Taiwan has been able to address these challenges, in recent years, I think these are things that have to be addressed continuously and going forward. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. We're really past time here. I wanted to thank our participants on our panel and our audience for this. Let me just close with a couple of quick things here. One is some fun things that have come into our chat function. Our old friend Marshall Meyer says, notes The Economist has just described Taiwan as the most dangerous place in the world with cross-strait threats. And Bob MacArthur notes that the Halifax International Security Forum is giving the 2020 John McCain Prize for Leadership in Public Service to Tsai Ing-wen. I think those two comments sort of sum up where we are. I will answer one other thing which came in, which is a U.S.-Taiwan FTA possible? On that, I would say read Peter Zhou's book Peter Zhou's chapter in our book, which says this would be a great thing for Taiwan, but darn hard to achieve. I think that's probably right. If you want more detail on that, I would suggest going to FPRI's webpage, where you can see my chat with the remarkable Xiaobi Kim, who is now Taiwan's ambassador equivalent to the United States, and she has some things to say about the bilateral trade agreement. We did our chat a couple months ago. But again, thank you, June Dreyer. Thank you, Vincent Wang. Thank you, Russel Hsiao. Thanks all the other contributors to the book. Thanks you all for tuning in. The book is outrageously priced, but worth every penny if you buy it in hard copy. The ebook is much cheaper, and we are hopeful that a paperback version will be out in the not too distant future. Thank you all. See you at our next event.